Hey folks, Ryan here. Just a quick note that we have suffered, I think, the rite of passage for your classic amateur podcast, and that we had a pretty severe technical glitch. Well, I'll let Alexi explain it.
I realized like a minute ago that my microphone was unconnected.
And so his audio quality is going to be quite bad, but it's still quite comprehensible, and I don't think it really detracts from anything except for the professionalism of the episode. But that happens sometimes, and as we progress, we'll hopefully fix those things up. Without further ado, let's get started. So, welcome back to Left Anchor. I am Brian Cooper, here with Alexi the Greek. Before we get started here, I just wanted to remind folks that if you want to contact us, our email is leftanchorpodcast@gmail.com, and follow us on Twitter at leftanchor, facebook.com/leftanchor, and we may have a couple of announcements for you about ways to support the show. So we've been getting some requests for that coming up in the next week or two. So, keep your ears to the ground about that. So, moving on to today's episode. This is a rough one. It's been rough news. So I think we're going to start with a discussion of this week in fascist murderers, and then we're kind of talk some theories after that and how to sort of explain and understand what's been going on around us, and maybe ways to think about it, and hopefully how to stop it from happening. So, first of all, we have the MAGA bomber. This guy Cesar Sayok. I am not sure, probably butchering that pronunciation as usual.
You've once again been given the duty of mispronouncing.
Yeah, this is my job. This is the burden I must carry. But so, this is a guy, he sent mail bombs to, I believe, 10 different Democratic politicians and activists. Basically, you saw these mail bombs that were sent out. They had misspellings in the names and addresses. They had sort of low rent Free Republic memes on there about Trump, and he sent it to all the most prominent targets of Donald Trump's ire. So it was Bill and Hillary Clinton, the Obama's house. It was George Soros, Maxine Waters.
CNN?
Yes.
Don't forget
CNN, yeah, Maxine Waters. Joe Biden, I believe, and maybe a couple of others. But so, go ahead.
Robert De Niro.
That's
Robert De
right.
Niro.
Yes. And yeah, so then it turns out, allegedly, but they have this guy supposedly on a fingerprint and a DNA match. It's a 56-year-old, just internet nutcase. He had this van that was just covered in memes and pictures and bumper stickers about Trump and Pence and, Soros, and just all the loony conspiracy theories that you see online from the, just the bilge of the right-wing internet. And this was a guy who just, he took, he's clearly not familiar with explosives, it seems like, because they said that, according to the FBI director, Christopher Wray, these weren't hoaxes. They were not made very professionally, and none of them went off. So, I think it was my friend Osita Nwanevu, a New Yorker writer, who coined the phrase. He was the first one I saw to say it, MAGA bomber, but absolutely that's what everyone immediately expected of this guy appears to be correct. And so, at least he's in custody, and nobody was killed or injured. Then we have something much worse, which is the synagogue shooting. And this obviously, if anyone's been watching the news, this was a mass shooting at a synagogue by an anti-Semite, allegedly, of course, Robert Bowers, guy from Pittsburgh. He allegedly murdered 11 people. He wounded 6 more, including 4 police officers. He'd just been notorious again for posting violent anti-Semitic stuff and memes online. On the far-right racist forum, Gab, he wrote, quote, "I can't sit by and watch my people get slaughtered. Screw your optics, I'm going in." And he specifically targeted this place, I forget what it's called, but it's like the Hebrew refugee agency. But basically his theory, his grievance that he had was that Jews, and specifically George Soros, were paying and otherwise conniving to infiltrate the United States with Muslims and Latino refugees. And so that's what he's talking about, supposedly, with this, my people get slaughtered. We're letting in immigrants kill people, and we just have to stop so that's the sort of train of logic here. And so he ran in yelling anti-Semitic slurs and just killed, shot the place up with a rifle.
On Sabbath, he went into a synagogue, and knowing there would be a lot of Jews, killed a number of people, including a couple brothers, a 97-year-old Holocaust survivor.
I'm not sure about the Holocaust survivor. I've seen people dispute whether that's true or not, but she was 97 years old.
She definitely survived a lot of things. So what's in question is whether she was
whether she is actually in in Europe at the time.
I see. Well, in any case, we have a white supremacist who was buying into a Jewish conspiracy to have brown people take away white America and erase the whites, essentially.
Yeah, right. Erase the whites, infiltrate the U.S. with criminals and just, create havoc and crime in the United States. And somehow Jews writ large are responsible for that. And I think, it's maybe worth pointing out, obviously the logic here is totally just twisted beyond recognition. It's absolute crazy nonsense, all of it. But in terms of, it's just like the really striking thing about this is the divergence, an absolute incongruity between the conspiracy and the actual reality of what's going on. And, so number one, you have these people whipping themselves into this fucking just maelstrom of hatred and murderous rage over a caravan, quote unquote, just basically a group of bedraggled women and children and families who just want to not be butchered by gang assassins and maybe a job landscaping or picking strawberries or working at Walmart or something, if they get really lucky. Just the most harmless fucking people you could possibly imagine.
A few thousand in a country of over 300 million, by the way.
325 million people in this country. And it is absolutely beyond question that if it weren't for Trump and it weren't for Fox News and it weren't for all these far-right websites whipping up panic about these people,
no one would know and no one would care.
No one would have any idea.
No one would notice. No one would notice.
There are existing communities. These folks are mostly from Honduras, because the Honduran murder rate is 90 per 100,000, which is, 18 times as much as the United States. There's a Honduran community in the Washington, D.C. It's like, yeah, you want to go get some Honduran food, you can go to, Petworth, Adams Morgan area. They're absolutely average people. And there exists in El Paso and San Diego and probably a dozen other cities. And that, America could absorb those folks, there are like 4,000 or 5,000 of them without even a blink.
Because there were 7,000, but a quarter of them sought asylum in Mexico so far, apparently.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, these are just people looking for asylum to go through a legal process of finding refuge. Which,
yeah, and
I know we're jumping the gun maybe, but it's just such an aggravating emotional thing. It's hard not to. But just the amount of land we have and the amount of space and the amount of accommodations and the ways in which communities can incorporate in our specifically pluralistic, heterogeneous country. Just think for a moment what, say, I don't know, Greece and other countries in Europe have done for just a magnitude greater number of refugees that they've been dealing with in ways that have their demerits and some ways in which we could laud them, but an unbelievable different scale of magnitude of humanitarian crisis that's been dealt with in compassionate, for the most part, ways. And we scare up something that's not even a crisis in any respect. And we're supposed to be, the moral leader, American exceptionalism, right? It's such a sad pretense upon which to do terrible, terrible violence that has no justification anyway. But to do it on, there's something you're pointing out that's interesting to me. To do such outrageous, horrific violence not just in a bigoted way, but in a senseless, terrible way, based on a narrative without any basis in fact, that's propped up by leadership of Trump, unchallenged by his party, is so maddening that I don't even know where to start.
Yeah. And again, to emphasize, this guy was getting his stuff not just from conspiracy fringe websites, but directly from the president of the United States, from the Republican Party, and from the major propaganda organs of the Republican Party, specifically Fox News. And after this happened, you had a guy on Fox News who, maybe I'll stick the audio of this in here, on Fox Business, actually, I think, on Lou Dobbs's show, who is making reference to that the Soros occupied State Department.
A lot of these folks also have affiliates who are getting money from the Soros-occupied State Department, and that is a very great concern. You want to start cutting money there.
Which is literally straight out of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, as Josh Marshall was pointing out on Twitter, which is that the government is being secretly run by Jews. And so you have this, this is not at all like some sort of dark, like secret underground email forwards or whatever he's getting this stuff. Like, this is from the top levels of the Republican Party. And the reason they're pushing this stuff is because they have nothing to run on. Their healthcare agenda is awful. Their tax cuts are extremely unpopular. And they're just, basically sort of settled on whipping the base into a froth of terror over a bunch of, powerless refugees as a substitute for any kind of concrete policy. And that, I think, ties in with what we were saying before about how, one of the ways that extreme, far-right extreme politics it is enabled is through that particular avenue of the uniting, economic policy for the 1%, by the 1%, with some kind of grievance, racism, bigotry to kind of buy off the rest of the population and if not trick them into thinking that whatever problems they do have are the fault of brown people in some way. Or Jews.
Yeah, look, fundamentally, the reason that socialism or barbarism is ultimately the choice when the failures of capitalism and economic liberalism devastate communities and people's lives, and there's constant precarity and any number of problems, is that leftist populism provides a structural analysis that suggests that we need to change the political economy and the very structures that give rise to that precarity. Of course, the right makes it all the more, that's challenging, right? That's fucking like devastating to even think about how impossible it seems to do that kind of change, right? The seduction of right-wing fascist anti-liberalism, right, is the promise that if you just get rid of and attack these groups are responsible for your suffering. They are the ones without which you would prosper. Is so seductive because it's so simple, right? And you don't need to know much. You don't have to have much of an education. You don't need to organize. You just need to know that brown people and Jews and whatever groups you can think of to blame for your alienation and suffering, they're the problem. And suddenly you can take all that agency that's been stripped from you by capitalism and now place it on groups who have all the control, like the Jewish control over everything. And suddenly there's meaning in your life because you understand now why everything's happening the way it is, and you know who to take it out on. And that's easy enough a thing to do without a literal direct blaming of people like Soros and of the media like CNN, who conveniently enough, right, media being attacked by Trump and the media being associated by racist conspiracists as being run by the Jews, it's a convenient trope and very easy for Trump and others to push in order to rile up his base. And it's disgusting.
Yeah, and the media as this kind of like the New York media, especially that you hear from people like Ted Cruz, that's got a very long and distinguished anti-Semitic undertone to it. The media being controlled by Jews as being this sort of like part of their tentacular propaganda apparatus, and yeah, I guess the other kind of aspect of this that is, I think, worth mentioning is that, like the phrase is that, anti-Semitism is the socialism of fools, so like you're identifying maybe perhaps like quasi-legitimate problems, so to speak, but then just like catastrophically perceiving the culprit. And so, where it's like, okay, yeah, George Soros is a rich guy, but like he's a milquetoast liberal at best. He's not some kind of revolutionary, and says so himself. He doesn't really like Bernie Sanders type of politics. Nevertheless, he is a rich guy, certainly. But what happens when you actually go into a synagogue? Is it full of George Soroses? Of course it isn't. He's like top 1% of the top 1%, even within the Jewish community. And the people that actually get killed, the people that actually were killed, there's just a shattering article in this, the Trib Live, Allegheny Trib Live. I'm not sure what this website is, but it's basically just a profile of these two guys. I'm sure you might have seen this. These two brothers, Cecil Rosenthal and David Rosenthal of Squirrel Hill, and they were among the people who were killed. And they were two, reportedly kind of mentally partly disabled, but not like seriously so. But they basically had managed to carve out like a decent kind of life for themselves. So they were kind of coaching basketball, and they had a lot of friends in the community, and the most like decent, almost saintly type of people you could imagine. Absolutely non-threatening, just nice, I don't, you struggle to describe it. It's just like the the absolute most senseless type of target for this sort of situation. Not having anything to do with politics or even understanding really of what politics is about. They're just guys who wanted to be, have like a pet and coach the local basketball team, and they're just shot to death because of rancid politics. And I think, that again is nothing new here, with the divergence between this fucking horseshit propaganda and the actual victims when it comes down to what these people want to do to Jewish communities. Because like in Germany, I've seen statistics that like in Germany of the Jews in Germany in 1933, like most of them got out. I think almost all of them did. By the time, that the really bad stuff started to happen, it's something like 80-90%, I think. And the real mass victims of the Holocaust were Polish peasants, just fucking farmers, because they didn't have any money. They didn't have any way to get out. And, it's like this whole industrial state dedicated itself to killing people who like to the idea that they were even had any sort of influence within their own country, let alone being the global puppet masters of politics, was fucking ridiculous on its face. And yet that's what they did. And so, I guess it's just to say that even though this may seem, and in fact is, absolutely the most crack-brained fucking idiot shit you could possibly imagine. It's like we're gonna go down to the halfway house for kind of people who are mentally disabled people to try to like go to the community center and like go swimming or something. Like we're gonna butcher those people specifically, and that's gonna solve all of our fucking problems. They'll do it. They absolutely will.
Yeah, it's one of the things that really is important to highlight is the ways in which, and I think this is obvious probably to most of our listeners, but it needs to be said anyway, the ways in which this is not just the actions of a mentally unwell individual. It's not just something that, oh, well, crazy people, right, to mentally, to stigmatize the mentally unwell, right? The crazy people will do anything, and you can't really, I literally saw a clip of, on Fox, Chris Wallace and Shepard Smith getting heated because Chris Wallace was trying to disabuse Shep Smith of any possible connection between the rhetoric of Trump, any culpability between Trump's rhetoric and the actions of just an unwell person. And there's, in a country of 320 million people, there's a few nuts out there, and they're going to do what they're going to do. And just doing the political work of severing any analytical, theoretical connection between this madness and the ideology being propagated by our president. It's really, really important because this reminds me too of, again, the Corey Robin thing about Trump being dangerous only insofar as he's just another Republican, which is true but also not true. And the way that it's not true is that this wouldn't have happened under George W. Bush, because there is a small but intense number of people who feed off of the racist, populist propaganda and ideological whipping up that Trump and his acolytes do. And the thing is, right, they have grievances and they just want to know where to direct them. And what Trump and others provide is a framework that gives them a way to make sense of where to direct those grievances and how to do it. Because don't think it doesn't matter that Trump has said, you know, if you punch somebody at one of my rallies, I'm going to pay for your legal expenses, right? Don't think that his wink, wink, nod, nod support of violence, machismo, and his buddying up with dictators, authoritarians all over the globe isn't connected, right? It's the body politic, right, is connected, and you see manifestations of the disease popping up for a reason, right? There's a reason this happened now instead of during George W. Bush's time.
Yeah. I think that's absolutely right. And I think that, you know, I mean, both of these guys were clearly not like what you would say unbalanced or of like mentally well balanced rather. But you know,
but the thing is that mental balance or unbalance doesn't happen in a vacuum, right?
Yeah, exactly. No, the point being that, you know, I think statistics on the level of assault, you know, committed by people who have mental illness is actually somewhat less than the background population. Exactly. And that actually mentally ill people are often victims of assault more often than they are perpetrators.
Absolutely.
Because, you know, like basically just beating up, you know, unwell homeless people on the street happens a lot. But yeah, I mean, in terms of the, you know, specific context of this, you know, you have a guy who was clearly drawn to right-wing politics and had very clearly been paying attention to the specific things that Trump was saying, which was specifically whipping up hatred, disgust, and anger at these particular people. And, you know, like it's just not, I mean, this really is pretty much straight out of how kind of pogroms happened. You know, it's not like, you know, pogroms in Russia in the 19th century were not because Russia had some sort of like genetic predisposition for anti-Semitism, just because like this is how these sort of like racist violence structures sort of like ensnare people and propagate themselves and result in these, you know, type of murderous situations.
You know, this is what I want to. So we'd planned to talk about David Hume and Judith Butler, and we're going to, but you know, I didn't know when it would be a good time to transition. But it just occurs to me when you brought up the disgust piece, it might be a good point to introduce David Hume, because you know we often think, and especially the liberal elite, if you will, like to blame Trump supporters as being ignorant, uneducated, and if only they had a proper education, then we can avoid all the disastrous opinions they have, and there wouldn't be any problems. Never mind, right, that the Stephen Millers and Richard Spencers are very well educated, and there's all kinds of Nazi assholes that have great educations, right? I think the disgust, the hatred, all these sentiments of which you speak that the shooter had, it's really important to see how Trump and fascist ideology operates on the affects and on the sentiments, because David Hume was a philosopher, a great philosopher of the Enlightenment, a Scottish philosopher, who wrote of many things, but his moral philosophy is particularly interesting here because it speaks to the role of sentiments. It speaks to the role of sentiment, the role of feeling, the ways in which how we feel about things and about people relate to our moral judgment and our moral action. So I think we should get into that.
One last thing I wanted to mention before we move on to the philosopher's stuff, which is that, just news breaking this evening as we're recording this was that Jair Bolsonaro, probably mispronouncing that too, he won the election in Brazil. Reportedly about 55% of the vote. He's basically a fascist, fascist-ish Pinochet type of figure. I would be very surprised if he, unless something changes, like there probably won't be an election again in Brazil. It will be back to a dictatorship within a few years. But yeah, so insanely racist, insanely anti, LGBT, anti-leftist, stoker of political violence is going to be president of the fourth largest democracy in the world.
Yeah, that is upsetting and of a piece. There's a global body politic and it's connected, and that's a sad development. I was reading about how even before he was elected, days before, it seemed like the military were busting into universities and stopping left-wing courses or courses that were teaching Marx or any number of censorial actions. So, fourth largest economy in the world seems to be in big trouble. Yeah.
Yeah, and just a quick bit of background here is that the actual most popular politician in Brazil is certainly Luiz da Silva. I think they call him Lula. Yeah, I think he was formerly the president, and he was going to run again, but he was imprisoned on very suspect corruption charges that almost certainly were basically trumped up by the right-wing judiciary and the right-wing prosecutors, basically to incarcerate the most popular, political opponent to the far right, because he's not even a socialist. He's a sort of like moderate, I would say moderate social democrat, basically, but the business class in Brazil preferred a fascist. And so they rigged the election basically by imprisoning the most popular politician. And so this is an important illustration of how democratic choices, I think it can be somewhat tempting to look at this and be like, what the fuck are people thinking?
Right.
It's like, how could you vote for this fucking guy? But it's important to note, that is a valid concern certainly, but it's important to note that democratic choice is kind of presumptively illegitimate, I would say, but it's definitely been structured in a way to foreclose the possibility of true choice, to where people could actually vote for, a wide slate of candidates.
Well, and that's, another episode for us to talk about the United States and our representative democracy, or our putative
quote unquote
republic. Even as a representative democracy, it is totally jiggered in order to suppress true democratic voice, and those levers have been used by the elites very well. And then, of course, neoliberalism and capitalism also collaborates to do just that. So that's another episode, but I think that's an important point to make. But it also harkens back to our previous episode on fascism and capitalism, which is to say that the elites, the wealthy, collude and enjoy those fascistic politicians who would help them gain and grow in their wealth and power, while those who do not actually benefit in power or wealth, but are enticed by the promise of the spectacle of violence and the false empowerment or the substitute for empowerment that they get from acting out and being given the room to be violent and enjoy the lashing out at groups that are putatively to blame for their otherwise unimportant, less than meaningful, and precarious lives, is all of a piece in this disgusting and sad national and global political situation in which we find ourselves. So, given all that, how can theory, how can political philosophy be a resource for us? One might ask. I'm going to ask. And
help us, Professor.
I got the gift of gab sometimes, and it gives me refuge in a time of sadness. And I wanted to make an analogy about being unmoored and we at the left anchor, but it seemed a bit much. So here we are. David Hume, 18th century, mid-18th century. Died in 1776, actually. Some fortuitous publications and deaths going on. Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations published in 1776. David Hume dies in 1776. Something else regarding the beginning of our country happened in 1776. I don't know. But Hume's moral philosophy is something that, although steeped in the Enlightenment, as he was, has less influence, it seems, than the more rationalist moral philosophies, in which reason seems to be at the heart of, or at the root, I should say, of how we think people should and do decide what is good, bad, and how to act. Here's the thing. Hume thought that while reason helps us make moral distinctions, it does not supply us with either the motive or desire, or finally, the judgment about what is good or bad, what is moral or immoral. And this is relevant because it occurred to me, and I teach undergrads, and they can appear somewhat sociopathic at times. And what I mean by that is that I will be telling them of, or even showing them visual images, right, of the most terrible atrocities, and especially the first years, because, it takes time to become less sociopathic. I will ask them how they feel about not what they think, but how they feel about what they've read or what they've seen. And I will invariably get, no, I don't know. I don't know. and I fear for our future and for their souls because I worry that they're sociopaths. And it occurred to me when teaching David Hume, who says that ultimately it's our sentiments, our feelings that matter, and that reason should be, which is counterintuitive to most, reason should be the slave to the passions, right? And not vice versa. It occurred to me that in sociopaths or psychopaths, it's not reason that they're lacking, it's feeling, it's empathy.
Yes.
Right? And so Hume discusses that, we need to educate our sentiments properly. We need to learn how to feel a certain way about the other. Because when you decide whether something is good or bad, ultimately that final judgment is aesthetic, he says. It's akin to taste. There's moral disgust or moral beauty that you feel.
Yeah, he has a nice quote here, which I liked.
Do it.
In his I guess an essay, an inquiry concerning the principles of morals, or if that's a book or whatever. But it says, quote, reason, being cool and disengaged, is no motive to action, and directs only the impulse received from appetite or inclination, by showing us the means of attaining happiness or avoiding misery. Taste, as it gives pleasure or pain, and thereby constitutes happiness or misery, becomes a motive to action, and is the first spring or impulse to desire and volition. End quote. Yeah, and I thought that was very perceptive, certainly for the time, and also a nice rebuke to the kind of like neo-positivist, scientistic type of people like Richard Dawkins or Sam Harris, and like you could just like reason out all of morality to sort of turn crank logic and stuff like that, and it's like, no, those are different types of thinking, and you can be a very rational, racist.
Exactly.
Or
and this harkens back to Rousseau, who basically shows that, even a horse has this innate pre-rational pity when it comes across the dead body of another horse or another animal. Whereas it's reason that allows us to rationalize that suffering is okay and to distance us from that natural pity, right? So our sentiments can be properly educated or they could be distorted, and then reason can get in the way of them and actually distort them from their innate ability to properly judge what is worthy of moral disgust or moral beauty, right? There's another quote, but this time I think by Judith Butler, that is worth connecting to this, just because.
Oh yeah, just to barge in here real quick. Judith Butler, to be clear, is a famous feminist critical theory academic. Someone who has, been a very pioneering and innovative scholar in those matters, and is, I would say, notorious for writing incredibly difficult to understand, kind of Hegelian style, deliberately obscure prose, but nevertheless is very influential today.
It seems to me that if it's true, and I think it is in a way, that reason can make all kinds of distinctions and can set up narratives for us, but really we need to have, and Hume says this, right? We need to be able to feel the whole, right? So reason can add facts or take away facts, and it can give reasons for things, but we need to have a sense of the whole, and that sense of the whole will make us feel a certain way. And that feeling is conditioned by the context, historical, social, and otherwise, in which we live, right? So we do not educate our sentiments alone. We learn how to feel both from our innate sympathy that maybe Rousseau spoke of, but also by learning through social relations and through the society in which we live, right? And if that's the case, then I think it makes Judith Butler's work on whose lives are grievable, on precarity, and specifically this is a quote from Frames of War, that I think further elucidates both the problem and perhaps where the solution lies, and then how it's connected to leftist theory and practice. So she writes, there's something important about the politics of moral responsiveness, namely, so this is a quote, that what we feel is in part conditioned by how we interpret the world around us, that how we interpret what we feel actually can and does alter the feeling itself. If we accept that affect is structured by interpretive schemes that we do not fully understand, can this help us understand why we might feel horror in the face of certain losses, but indifference or even righteousness in light of others? And then here she talks about war. In contemporary conditions of war and heightened nationalism, we imagine that our existence is bound up with others with whom we can find national affinity, who are recognizable to us, and who conform to certain culturally specific notions about what the culturally recognizable human is. This interpretive framework functions by tacitly differentiating between those populations on whom my life and existence depend, and those populations who represent a direct threat to my life and existence. When a population appears as a direct threat to my life, they do not appear as lives, but as the threat to life, a living figure that figures the threat to life. And although she's speaking of war and the ways that the lives that are grievable tend not to include those whom our nation kills on our behalf in war on the battlefields, through drone strikes, I think that piece about recognizing or not recognizing the human, depending on our interpretive scheme about who and whose lives do we depend on and which lives are a threat to our existence, is so salient and connected to what Trump and others do when they take these groups, like those in the caravan, right, and Jews, and basically say to someone like this shooter, those people are not human. Those are, in fact, the direct threat to your life. And you might well feel righteousness in taking out that threat. You might well feel heroic. And I think that is a bone-chilling but spot-on way to understand why such a monster could have done what was done yesterday.
Yeah, I there's a lot of wisdom there, and I think that, she's talking about war, right? And again, I guess like obviously we're not saying that this type of thinking is necessarily rational, right? Like obviously this synagogue was not any kind of actual threat to this person, but what this right-wing pathology does, and how this like increasingly extreme right-wing rhetoric does, is activate that kind of thinking, which may be logical in a sort of its own context when you're in like an actual war, where it really kind of is, kill or be killed type of situation, and deploying it on behalf of absolutely, anodyne, powerless people who are just like going to synagogue on a Saturday morning, and how, that process of political, brain curdling.
But you know what though, Ryan? Like, reason is always situated in these narratives and ideologies that give meaning and structure to our lives. Like, it actually is also crazy if you're a soldier in a war to just kill. Like, if you think about it, like, it's normalized. Yes. It's normalized. It's like, oh, of course it makes sense I just killed this brown person in front of me because I'm a soldier in the U.S. Army and I'm in Iraq. And, like, of course that makes sense. But if you think about it, it's fucking bananas that that's the case, right?
Yes.
Like, it's also crazy. But reason, right, feels like it makes sense when it has these structures behind it. And so to us, it's even crazier that this particular narrative gave rise to this logic of violence. But like most logics of violence, if you really think about them, are totally unnecessary and fucking crazy.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess in the context of a war, most war, I would say there's maybe like 2 or 3 wars you could point to where it really was a situation of like there kind of was no way around this. Like the Civil War, for example, the American Civil War, a kind of a war in which they're genuinely like, this is the only way we're going to solve this particular problem. And the end result was a massive increase in human flourishing and freedom.
Yeah, I think that's a good point.
And then obviously World War II. But yeah, as it's like for the situation of the soldier in Iraq, it's like, okay, we're in this situation where like, we're sort of fighting these like this shadowy insurgency, and like it can be sort of rational to think about like, okay, well, I have to be very suspicious of anybody driving up to this checkpoint because it might be a car bomb or whatever. That part of it's rational. The craziness comes in, that absolute irrationality comes in, like, why are we in this country in the first place? Like that part is every bit as in just lunacy as any kind of act of mass violence in, domestic setting.
Well, and that's a good point, because look, the threat in an actual war is very obvious and very focused on, like, literally there's people with weapons here, I have weapons, and this is war. But the violence that someone like this shooter felt is the everyday violence of capitalism, neoliberalism, and the daily meaninglessness of the social structures and social relations produced by those structures, right? And so that is a much more complicated thing to cope with and be like, okay, I need to figure out who the enemy is here so I can have agency and be empowered and fight it. And all the more pernicious in that situation is that those who actually represent the elites in those systems that give rise to that daily violence, peddling the kind of propaganda and conspiracy theories that pit the Jews and brown people and whomever else as those who deserve to be acted out against. So it is rational and it fits in a narrative in a way. It's just that like the cause of the initial grievance against the shooter and those like him is much more diffuse and complicated to figure out if you don't have like a good grounding in like political theory and like, you know, if you don't have a good left anchor. Then you might be seduced by some explanation that's easy, simple, and gives you a way to find yourself as a soldier in this war against the violence that you feel, right? So it's a different kind of battle, but one where it's equally logical to him, right? It's just a more complicated scenario in which a logic has to be constructed.
Do you think though that this guy was kind of these folks were actually responding to anything, or were they just kind of
as opposed to what? Yeah, as opposed to what?
Well, as opposed to just kind of like getting, it reminds me. I guess the way I imagine this kind of happening, obviously I've never been like an anti-Semitic murderer, but the way I imagine this happening is, you have people who maybe they have like a reactionary kind of instincts, but they just they go online, they get in these communities, they start listening to Fox News and, the right-wing talk show hosts, and it's just like this process of further and further and further radicalization where they kind of, I imagine it as being similar to, sometimes I'll like watch a video on YouTube. And unfortunately, I find YouTube like quite addictive sometimes. Like I'll watch a video about like a cell phone on YouTube, and YouTube will serve me
my name is Ryan, and I haven't watched a YouTube video in 5 days.
So they watch a video about a cell phone. They're like, "Oh, this new cell phone's coming out," and then they'll serve me up like 10 more videos about cell phones, and I'll watch that one and be like, "Oh, this looks like a nice one," and then, I'll sort of black in 45 minutes later, while I've been like doing dishes or something. And and now I'm an expert in all the cell phones that are coming out in the next month. Is the notch good? Is the notch bad? Well, let me tell you, I don't, I'm never going to buy one of these things. But I wonder if that isn't more, if it isn't more of a just totally internal to the sort of like ideology and structures of these type of discursive spaces, to where it's like the outside world, like the actual like reality of whatever this person is doing in their daily lives has almost nothing to do with it at all. And you're just like, I'm just getting really into racism, and I just want to like start murdering people. And like nothing's changed or justified this in any way. Like I just really I just think that this needs to happen now. Yeah. But again, it's sort of a supposition on my part.
Look, neither of us is a psychologist or, forensic expert of criminology or something. But that being said, right, like insofar as this is a symptom of a broader problem, which is that like your subjectivity, his subjectivity is shaped by what you do and what you think, and what you do and what you think are shaped in so many ways by what you have available to you. And so if you're in a situation where what you have available to you in your time after you work like however many hours you're trying to struggle through life is like fucking YouTube and like online rooms, and when you do that, the reason might be because you have nothing else to do and it's a thing that you can get wrapped up in and it's addictive or whatever. But the result of it is that your sentiments are educated a certain way. So he, for sure, came to find, whether he had it from age 2 or not, I don't know his history, whether or not it had to be helped along a lot or a little bit, his moral sentiments were shaped so he had moral disgust at certain groups. Okay? And whether it's Trump or these online chats or whatever, that was shaped by the circumstances and the people and the social relations around him in such a way that Alistair McIntyre, which, very few leftists are going to love, although he has Marxist roots, talks about the way that our personal identity cannot, as liberals think, be something that is created in a vacuum out of nowhere. It is tethered to, right, narratives that are on offer from the time and place in which we live. Okay, so in the time and place in which we live, people's narratives are shaped sometimes on the internet, sometimes through politicians speaking, right? And so his personal identity got bound up. And if you don't have meaning in life, right, if you don't have a telos to which you're working, that's when people want to kill themselves because they don't know what they're doing anything for. It's all arbitrary. Except that for anyone, you can find meaning, apparently, in being a hero who's a racist, who thinks that certain groups are responsible for the decline of the United States, etc., etc., and you can find meaning and agency in acting out against those groups. So I do think that those narratives and Trump and those online rooms or whatever else, and maybe I'm dating myself by talking about chat rooms because it's probably not. It's not at all.
Twitter is a big chat room.
Exactly, right? The point is that, like, in a neoliberal society and political economy in which there's so few easy ways to find not just security but meaning, and all the more where precarity is involved, you seek out narratives that give you meaning despite that, right? I think that, like, as unwell as he might be, it is undeniable that these narratives shaped the ways in which he thought he could exercise agency against particular groups, And that's just, like, something that wouldn't happen otherwise if not for the conditions that capitalism gave rise to, and then the ways in which people like Trump took advantage of those conditions to give narratives that blamed certain groups. I don't know if that answers your query. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that, you're talking about the broader context, and I'm thinking more of like the sort of like self-radicalized lone wolf, kind of Al-Qaeda-esque person. But
these people wouldn't exist unless they thought there were others who would love what they're doing, though. They're seeking, ironically, they're seeking recognition, right?
Yeah.
Which is like,
I think.
Don't you think?
Yes, I think that's right, and I think I guess the one overarching structure here, which has to do with capitalism, certainly is the how these 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 social media platforms are operated and funded, and how they make their money, and how they do not crack down at all they're very reluctant to crack down on extreme right propaganda because it's very profitable, because lots of people watch that crap. And also, as we've spoken before about how, like, these types of narratives are very convenient for plutocrats who, would like, want to feed their base anything other than actual economic populist policy. Yeah, and I guess, I don't know. I mean, I guess I'm somewhat out of my depth here, and you're talking about the political psychology and so forth.
No, but what were you were, I mean, I don't want to disregard your point, which is, like, you think that maybe we shouldn't get too kind of, I don't know. You wanted to make it a little bit simpler in a way, right?
Well, what I wanted to make clear was that I think there's a way, I think that a lot of the debate about sort of, like liberals make lol economic anxiety jokes on Twitter all the time. And I definitely, I think that there's a certain, like, class of Trump voter that you might kind of have a little bit of sympathy for, or you might even if you don't have sympathy war, you might view as winnable. You know, someone who's like not into, really doesn't care about immigration maybe, or just like a second tier issue and is voting for Trump because he hated Hillary Clinton. You know, your Richard Ojeda type of person who is actually running for Congress in the West Virginia 3rd District and voted for Trump and now says he regrets that. He is very much pro-legal immigration, wants a path to citizenship and all that kind of thing. But, you know, and so, like, even if you could say, like, it is more or less indefensible to be voting for Trump, you might say it's like, still, we might say, all right, whatever. I'm going to let bygones be bygones. You recognize your mistake. But then that, you know, like when it comes to, you know, anti-Semitic mass murderers, at least in this particular context of just like a single person, you know, going on this sort of spree killing, I definitely don't want to associate inadvertently justify that anyway, I guess, is the sort of point I was trying to make. And just to be like, you know, I don't think that.
I see. So you can explain away, if not support, certain support for Trump because of certain people's conditions and rationales for lesser of two evils or whatnot. But in no such way could that kind of logic apply to this kind of monster. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, right. And I mean, you know, I mean, I guess you think about, it's like if you think about Germany under Nazi rule, I guess that's a kind of a different situation because you can't ever take like a genetic determinist type of view of that to just be like the German brain pan is right. Just predestined to support anti-Semitism.
Well, no, I think you're concerned with the fact that if Trump is culpable, that takes away the moral agency and culpability of the actual shooter. That's not true at all. The same way that general Nazis were still responsible for their horrible actions, despite the fact that Hitler was necessary and very, very culpable in spurring that on. That they were both at fault, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I guess, you know, that's just the kind of like the thing I want to emphasize is to say that, you know, in no way for looking for these sort of contextual factors does it excuse or make any kind of moral excuse for you know, being a fucking Nazi murderer.
Well, no, but here's the fucking thing. Like, our system is set up in throes with liberalism as it is to take out and punish the individual. So, like, there's no fear the individual is going to be punished for the individual's action, right? Like, that's a given. The thing that, like, the work of assigning blame and culpability, what happens is that when people emphasize the individual, they forget the structures and they forget the other actors that influence that. And so by pointing that out, we want to expand the range of culpability and not delimit it, right? Like of course the individual is going to be on the hook, right? We just don't want that to kind of elide or kind of take away from the other important factors that we also should work. And actually the things that will have lasting influence that we can affect are those structural and social ideological things, right?
That's a great point. And yeah, that's I think you've clarified my thinking there. And that makes a lot of sense because yeah, you know, you see this from people being like, oh, it's, you know, you're sort of excusing people if you try to explain why people might have voted for Trump and so on and so forth. But, you know, if you take that too far to its like sort of logical extreme, you end up with the kind of who was that guy we were talking about before? The Chris Wallace, who's like, oh, it's just the one person. It's the one person, and no one, you know, it's their individual fault, and nothing else can ever be adduced to explain what's going on here. It's definitely not Trump's fault, and it's not Fox News' fault.
Exactly.
And not my fault specifically.
There are no political opinions to be taken from this incident. Just enjoy the spectacle of violence for what it is. It has No, there should be nothing that you change about what you think or who you vote for that comes from this, basically.
There's one more quotation from the Judith Butler piece, The Frames of War piece, that I think is so we talk about whether it's political psychology, whether it's the sociological or political economy analysis of the structures that give rise to these kinds of problems, and the body politic manifests itself in these individuals who themselves are shaped in response to these forces, right? And we can't take away their moral agency and their responsibility, but at the same time, they are responding to people like Trump and conditions that capitalism gives rise to, et cetera, et cetera. But that analysis feels like it doesn't give us hope. And where can we find the prescriptive, right, theoretical moorings for us? And where can we find some semblance of what to do in response to this? And so, I'm going to give you one last quote from Judith Butler, because in the same way that the social ontology helps create the conditions that give rise to people who act in this way, who see others' lives as not grievable, as not human, who target others because they think those groups, those people are to blame, and so on and so forth. At the same time, the opposite way of thinking is something we can inculcate personally, socially, politically. And I think you might enjoy this, the hope, at least, in this quote. So Judith Butler writes, "I think this is finally a Hegelian point, and one worth reiterating here. The reason I am not free to destroy another, and indeed why nations are not finally free to destroy one another, is not only because it will lead to further destructive consequences. That is doubtless true. But what may be finally more true is that the subject that I am is bound to the subject I am not, that we each have the power to destroy and the power to be destroyed, and that we are bound to one another in this power and in this precariousness. In this sense, we are all precarious lives."
That's good. That's good. Yeah, and I think, the last thing I'll say is that, I grew up in Utah and Colorado, not notably Jewish places. Mormons weirdly called non-Mormons Gentiles for some reason. I am not Mormon, for the record. But, I think this is a moment you see leftists sometimes saying, like when some kind of horrifying atrocity happens, being like, "Oh, this is America," and if you're not on board with that, you're naive, you're a fool. And I think that in a descriptive sense that may be right, but in an aspirational sense, I think I really kind of strongly disagree with that type of sentiment. And I think that especially when it comes to anti-Semitism, which is like the worst belief in history, like it's led to the worst things that have ever happened. America, I think, genuinely has not had that type of problem to the same extent. I mean, it's always been here to some degree or another, but it's never been the type of hegemonic, totalizing, murderous ideology as it has been. And I think that, this is just a time for all leftists to say that, if you are Muslim, if you are, Yazidi Christian, if you are, Quaker or some other type of oppressed religious community, and especially if you are Jewish, we just have to extend solidarity to all of our comrades out there to say that
we're with you. We are with you.
Even us cis white men from the middle class, like it is just absolutely fucking appalling to me to see this type, and I regard anti-Semitism as just the most disgusting thing. And you know, we're all searching for ways that could sort of make sense and to help, you know, the Jewish community, the Muslim community, and so on and so forth. But, you know, this really is a time for solidarity across all of these type of minority communities. And I think that includes leftists as well. You know, it like that Bolsonaro guy, he's promising to go after the socialists, I think, before anyone else.
Look, because Jewish lives matter, all lives matter. Because Black lives matter, all lives matter. In the solidarity of recognizing the oppression and suffering of groups at the hands of those that find them less than human, we affirm our humanity, we support our humanity. We are all human, we are all worth loving, we all have the right to life and the right to prosper. We love you, we love all the groups because we fight for all the oppressed groups. We believe that we're fighting for everyone, and all that are against us, may we change their hearts, and if we don't change their hearts, may we conquer them.
Yes, exactly. Very well put.
All right, well, that'll do it for this heavy episode of Left Anchor. But this will not be the end of our discussion of violence and fascism and capitalism and of the many things we need to think through. In order to combat.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think this is a topic that is not going away anytime soon. But there's just no getting around it, unfortunately.
But that being said, I love you, Coops. Give my love to Emma. And I always love talking with you and talking things through.
Back at you.
All right. Well, until next time, people, that's Left Anchor.
Good night.